Minor Compositions. Today we are joined by two very, very super interesting comrades. First, we have Jack C. Bratich. Hi, Jack.
Hello.
And then we have, and I'm going to try really hard to not butcher your name, Eva Majewska.
Hello.
I got it. Yes. Excellent.
Very nice to
Excellent.
be there.
Good start. Good start. And my thought here is I wanted to invite you two along in part because, like many of these episodes, because I am very interested in both of your books. In Jack's case, his book from, was it 2 years ago, Jack?
But almost 3 now. It was January 22 came out.
Yeah, your book on microfascism, gender, death, and war, and Eva's book, Feminist Antifascism, Counterpublics of the Common. Now, there's no way I could think of than to better kick off the holiday season with a nice, Yuletide discussion of everyone's favorite topic to be super depressed about, because it's unfortunately very relevant: fascism. Yay!
Yay!
But in particular, I thought it'd be interesting to have a chat with both of you, because I wanted to maybe think through some of the ways in which, let's say, I keep wanting to say emergent fascism, but maybe I should just say current fascism at this point. Yeah. Is gendered in particular ways, thinking through like how that operates, and maybe some of the ways in which also thinking through anti-fascism has to be necessarily thought through a feminist gendered lens, thinking about social reproduction. So that's sort of like the big picture sort of like topic. So maybe as a way to start that, and one of the reasons I want to talk about this conversation now is that I was thinking about this after the last U.S. election, and it was an election which the Twitterati and the talking heads have been going on about nonstop. One thing that struck me about it in the discussion was the idea that it was a kind of podcast election, right? The idea that that Joe Rogan had a sort of significant effect in an election, right? The idea that all of a sudden this was sort of like the manosphere having a significant impact in electoral politics and swinging things. And one thing that was pointed out to me is if you look at, given this sort of shift in the youth vote, particularly the young male vote, in a rightward direction, one of the things that pointed out to me is that almost every single hobby, whether gaming, podcasting, lots of online activity, are either dominated by alt-right voices or people who are skewing rightward, right? So if we're in this sort of moment of at least some of the Overton window shifting right, and it's going that way because of particular things around gendered politics, how the fuck do we get here? Like, how do we make sense out of that? And what does it mean that contemporary fascism, or maybe this is nothing new, maybe fascism has always been had particular gender dynamics, but I just wanted to sort of think through that as a dynamic. So let's take that as the starting point. And with that, I'll kick it towards you and see what you want to kick off, Jack?
Well, sure. Since it's a U.S. based, question, I'll start. Some specifics about the U.S. Obviously, it has global implications. Maybe I'll see a couple of things there. It opens up, a lot of questions. I think I'll try to focus on. There's always a longer history of this that we can talk about. And I'm happy to do that, and that's what the book really addresses. Also, is how archaic some of this is, even. But in terms of I think the way I would think about it, especially around the manosphere, I think this is the moment. Like the Trump election showed that it was the first time that the manosphere voted, meaning there were particular appeals to men as men to go and vote as men, and in ways that wasn't clearly the case, I think, in the past couple of presidential elections. It was always there, right? It was always part of the culture, or a part of the kind of subjectivity of what counts as, values and priorities and policies. But
So maybe a bit of saying the quiet part out loud.
yeah, and I don't even know if it was that quiet. It was just ignored. But yes, I would say in the ways other people have talked about, the gloves came off, right? When the kind of like that was mostly after the election where the or that. So yeah, the quiet part. So it was the manosphere had voted, and you could specifically point to very things related to podcasts that I can also go into. I don't want to spend too much time. We can always follow up on it. The other thing is, I think the what we learned is something that I noted a couple years ago. Is like the manosphere was kind of a misnomer because it almost wanted to name a sector or part of the internet, where I always thought it was a project of taking over the internet. The manosphere was a set of we can name some groups or some tendencies or some subcultures in it, but it was tied to things like going out, like during Gamergate, like going out and harassing women who are journalists. So it was always a series of campaigns and a kind of colonizing effort as well. So I think that became quite clear. So your point about the hobbies, Stephen, is right on to that, right? Because it was all these spaces now, these fandoms, especially fandoms around particular kinds of podcasts, fandoms around sports, around gaming, a number of those places, but almost any kind of fandom now you'll find being in the forums, in the comment sections, being run by these patriarchal, young patriarchal to be figures, or fratriarchal, as some might call them. Anyway, so yeah, so I think there's something very key both to podcasting, and we can talk about that too. But I mean, I think the transition over the last 4 to 7 years was that we moved from the alt-right kind of using memes and digital technologies and communities to a more organized and platformed version within these podcasts and fan groups and hobbyists.
That sounds very different from the Polish
Hmm.
elections. Luckily, the last ones were not so bad, but we are expecting presidential elections in March, so we will see how the manosphere is going to respond to that. Let's put it this way. So in Poland, we have a striking discrepancy or striking conflict between the youngest generation of voters when it comes to men and women age 18-24, so the youngest group of voters, when it comes to their political opinions. So the majority of the young men votes for radical right wing, and the majority of the women that age votes for radical left wing. So not only there is a big disappointment with, I don't know, online dating and whatever, people are disappointed that internet did not bring the knights on white horses who are gentlemen and feminists and also earn a lot of money and all those things. But also there is those people don't meet, basically. Those young people, the youngest group of voters in Poland don't meet, strikingly. So this tells you a little bit about especially the youngest generation. And obviously we have phenomena such as podcasts and manosphere, but I wouldn't say they are so prominent as in the US or the UK even. I would say it exists, but so we have certain podcasters that suddenly generate huge, popularity and huge interest. But I wouldn't say that the right wing so explicitly occupies entire sectors of internet life, let's put it this way. It is a little bit more complicated than that. What we have, however, is more traditional right-wing organizations and political parties, which gather more classical right-wing electorate, I would say. So while the internet is, of course, full of all kinds of trolls and incel sort of groups, although incelism also was much smaller of a phenomenon than in UK, for instance, in Poland, I mean. But so I would say that in Poland, it's more a certain version of a state. And when I was reading your book, Jack, I was thinking a lot about fascism as a form of state. So I was kind of friendly, in a friendly disagreement with your diagnostics, let's say, which follows Roger Griffin and some other authors that you enumerate very eloquently, by the way. I loved the plethora of references that are super interesting, very updated, so going to the Second World War and write around it, but really focusing on the current literature. So that was fantastic part of the process of reading your book. And so yeah, so this form of state, which you don't seem, although probably there is more to say about that, and I will be happy to hear from you about it. So this form of state in Poland is something that actively belongs and actively shapes the fascist desire and the fascist dream. So they really want a state which is going to be full on devoted to restoring the tradition. So it's more on the level of what kind of, so it's not so much like what kind of lifestyle we want to have, and more, and I would call it traditionally, and more classic sort of, more classic form of electoral behavior is basically a dream of a certain state that is going to accomplish certain values. And obviously, lots of podcasting and going on, but still, and it's not that internet is small in Poland. Internet is quite huge here, and Poland has also a fantastic history of fighting for the freedoms of internet, and those fights are amazing also because right wing and left wing sort of go hand in hand with, you know, demanding the freedom of even from copyright all along. But I would say that here our countries differ, and substantially, and really and I'm not sure if these phenomena are ever coming to Poland soon. I believe that still this vision of, you know, the church as one of the main organizers of daily life, the politics understood as state apparatus, which is incredibly precise in how fascism is being installed in every domain of social life. These were the organizing factors. So slightly different, you know, slightly different cultural process, I would say.
An interesting example that this has happened over the past few days is there's been some quite heated online discussions in response to the latest iteration of Poland's most successful product, which would of course be The Witcher. Have you seen the trailer for the new Witcher? Okay, well, long story short, it's for the fourth game, and in this game, Ciri, who was a side character in the third one, is now the main protagonist. So just cue all the angry dudes getting upset about like female main character, roar, to go along with female main character not attractive enough, roar. And what's interesting about watching this response is if you had played the games or read the books, you would know that where they end at 3 is where Geralt, the male protagonist, like literally retires. And so there's very logical reasons inside a story world why this is happening. It makes total sense. But the thing is, what strikes me is that the people being angry about this aren't people who actually know the games inside and out and know why this makes narrative sense. They're mobilizing it as a point, an inflection point of resentment, maybe to fantasize about going back to an earlier, maybe a state, or maybe a sort of imagined state of like when gaming was better when I was a kid, or how the imagined early state of gaming as a kid somehow connects to articulating a certain political vision.
Absolutely. No, I mean, Poland is a paradoxical country. I think we might be the only country in the world which has a exec for the same amount of Nobel Prizes for men and for women. I don't know if you knew that. And we have several of those prizes, which sort of, I'm not bragging, but there we are. And so so that's a paradox. I mean, one of them is Marie Curie. So if we put Marie Curie in France, then the proportions differ. But as she got 2 of them, she sort of nicely balances the scales. But what I'm trying to say is that Poland has a history of, on one hand, allowing women to go and do things that were really, you know, leadership, political powers, all kinds of things that were related with domains restricted to male agency. And then on the other hand, there is the Holy Virgin, as this like deess of the Catholic Church, right? Almost a deity figure. And the ultimate submission, so, you know, a woman who gives birth to a child resulting of a rape, you know, as an icon of entire culture, basically. And that also influences the sense of submissiveness and traditionality. But I believe that there are not many countries where the contradictions of the gender roles are so high as in Poland. So I would say that a game like that, where a woman character precisely takes over after a guy who was like very prominent male game hero. So the very possibility sounds very Polish, but also this reaction sounds, I mean, I know that you're quoting reactions from all over the world probably, but yeah, I can very well believe that many Polish men are going to be very unhappy about how things happened in the Witcher.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like to me like there are a couple of things coming up there. One is a kind of the contradictions and tensions of any particular context, often involving things like backlash. So sometimes the more prominent women can be in either positions of power or successful financially or in popular cultural representations, you get a kind of also a backlash against that. And I guess I would say the other tension is an interesting one, because in the US, right, the history of its claims to secularity, right, and secularism and modernity as a non-religious state and a non-religious nation is also coming unraveled, meaning like the growth of the and persistence of Christian nationalism in the US is fundamentally, I think, the most organized force, more than the state. Even the state is sprawling, and there are many dimensions to it. There's sometimes in conflict. Even the repressive state apparatus, even the realm of like the FBI versus other departments, the ways the police are. So even as fragmented as that can be, sometimes there is the kind of more national patriarchal version of Christianity that is foundational, right, and bubbles up. But it's not sort of the state is secondary to that in ways that it can bring them in, and it does bring them in. They come into the state. That's their project. The Christian nationalist project is to take over the state. So it's I guess what I pointed out partially in the book was more about part of the answering or addressing some of the questions like how was Trump possible in the US given its history, and so to address that by saying yes, actually there are these tendencies in culture itself that can easily be sort of gathered and formalized, even if the state is the kind of goal and the secondary part and not the actual space where this gets worked out. It gets worked out in culture and then enforced and codified by the state, more in the US, I would say, or at least recently that's how it's been. But certainly it's not as though the state doesn't matter. It's that I think people miss some things when they focus on the state in the US, at least.
One of the things I'm intrigued by, or maybe horrified by as well, is a bit what you talk about, Jack, is kind of like a fascist kind of meta-politics, where you sort of almost attempt, the idea is to change certain cultural norms, but not through directly stating them. And that comes to play in a lot of what we things, and maybe this is an older version of it, where we were talking about sort of like meme politics, right here. And so I'm thinking here of like I'm in a walking football club, right? And so a lot of times the people will be posting memes I think of as being like a crappy right-wing meme. But if I sit here and write like a small essay in response to why this is problematic, I look like a lefty asshole, right? Because so it's almost like the kinds of political statements where you can both make them and disavow them at the same time, or it was just for the lulz, man. Why so serious? So, but I'm curious about how you engage with that kind of like meta-political shift, where if you take it too seriously, you look silly. If you don't take it seriously, you look silly. It's almost like it just like the category becomes so slippery, where it's like, how do you engage with a form of political rhetoric that almost refuses to take itself seriously, but is more effective because of that?
I believe that Slavoj Žižek has some answers to that. I mean, his analysis of the nationalist humor as a bonding, as a tool for bonding, is I think fantastic and sort of relevant here, because what you don't want to destroy when you comment on this kind of memes is definitely your relation with other people who see and read the meme, right? You don't want the connection to be stopped. So therefore, to remain in a connection, to remain in a, I mean, I'm using the narrative of nonviolent communication from Marshall now, which is very paradoxical. But anyhow, you want to stay connected. So the extent of seriousness has to be measured in such a way that the connection is not cut. And this sounds very abstract, but in the process of communication, I believe that we all have a sort of gut feeling about when we are disconnected. Now, for instance, you're looking at me a little bit like as if I was talking, a very cosmic, far away, distant story. So I see that connection is being dismantled. And in order to return, I sort of slightly ridiculize myself so that you return and listen to me more carefully, right? So this is, so you don't want to undermine the need of humor as a relation making, as a bond making quality, and yet you still want to defend certain, I don't know, persons, groups, and rights. And there is also, I mean, there is a certain, I would say there is a certain futility in that, because I believe that right-wing memes humor is par excellence nihilistic. And actually, this is, again, where the book, where Jack's book resonates very nicely, because this nihilism is an element of fascism. I do agree on that part. And those memes, they constitute a mild interface, a mild appearance, a mild version of the nihilism inherent in fascism. So basically, putting this nihilism in the spotlight might be fun as well. I don't know if this is feasible, but perhaps,
I think we missed about 10 seconds where the nihilism got you for a second.
Yeah, I think I lost maybe some connection, literally. It froze up on me.
Oh, okay. So what I'm trying to say,
you're talking about hedonism and then talking about nihilism, and then it broke a bit.
Yeah, so the thing is that I believe that this nihilism is one of the most hidden secrets of fascism. So sort of, shifting the attention from the seriousness and supposed idioticism of your criticality versus those memes to the, unexpected appearance of death in the middle of this supposedly funny narrative, that could be interesting. I'm not sure, this kind of the conversations are always very context based, and so therefore it's very difficult to predict a scenario where you win a discussion like that. But I think that ridiculizing the very presence of such a demonic force as nihilism in this context might bring some results. I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you think microfascism transforms the idea of the public sphere? Or can we even talk about public spheres or counterpublics in a situation of microfascism? Here I'm thinking of, okay, an essay that a little reference I think particularly useful, but really gets ignored, is there's a section of Virnow's Grammar of the Multitude where he's talking about immaterial networks. We start talking about the idea of publicness without a public sphere. The idea that everything is public, but there is no actually public sphere there. It's all like immaterial networks, but there's like nothing, but there actually is no space in them. It's all like crisscrossing flows, but there's no like there's no way to move in it, almost in a way.
Yeah, and I don't use the word public or public sphere very much, so I'd be curious to hear, Eva, what how me address this. I mean, I guess from that Virno, for me is the idea that almost like the bonding elements that bring together, that have a kind of commonness to them, become increasingly visible, and therefore modifiable. And whether it's our linguistic capacities, whether it's he doesn't really talk about like shared stories or something, but so so that kind of publicness, I mean, I might be missing some of it, but sometimes it was like the capacities that we share that we often don't sort of foreground, right? Linguistic capacities, I think, is one of his main ones that he brings up. So I guess for me, yeah, I mean, I do think about scale, like microfascism. I think about networks in the past. I think about, clusters, associations, assemblages. Getting to something called a public or a public sphere is not something that sort of I think easily kind of comes to me as a figure of togetherness or association that mostly because to me it tends to follow, accompany, adjust to something that is typically called a state. So I think for me, and that's the kind of stuff that Michael Hart did on the history of, like, civil society too, and that I always found interesting is, like, when those things are permeated with power and control mechanisms, what would it mean to constitute a public sort of outside of those? But anyway, that's sort of my fumbling around for thinking through why microfascism can scale, certainly, and but I'm not sure about the public being the way it scales. But Eva, I don't know what you think.
Many thoughts, because public sphere and counterpublics specifically are at the center of my interest. So I'm trying to figure out how to speak not too long, and not to give you a lecture about public sphere and its contestations and discussions and whatever. So I'll try to keep it short. But I think that from the perspective of microfascism, from the perspective of Deleuze and Guattari and this minoritarian philosophical activist point of view, the public sphere is one of the most demonic mechanisms and demonic political entities, especially when it is not only present but also portrayed and emphasized to be an expression of the bourgeois, of the hegemonic of the privileged mind and privileged needs and privileged desire. So if we look at the public sphere, at the liberal public sphere, as a place, as a site of expression of desires of solely hegemonic groups, so solely those who can actually be first enter and then also be heard and understood in the public sphere, then it is a very exclusionary, incredibly, I mean, you can say fascistic instrument in some way. So that's how I would see the liberal public sphere. It's not a very beautiful image. It's an image that I would run away from if I could. Unfortunately, it exists there. So here is where and how my anarchism probably differs from most anarchisms that we have known. For many years, I've been doing proper anarchist activism, sort of, away from the state or against the state. And now, when I discovered that this such thing as public sphere exists, so a thing which is always positioned in relation to a state, however, it is not generated by the state as such. It uses public media, for instance, but it is supposedly, operating on the content created by individual or groups, but not the state as such. And very often it is critical of the state in ways that we might even agree with. So very tricky entity, and an entity that goes against the traditional divisions into, I don't know, revolution, reform, because sometimes certain moments for public sphere, liberal public sphere, are revolutionary. For instance, in the 70s, when abortion becomes legal, right before Roe and Wade, I believe that what happens in the discourse of the public sphere in the United States of America is actually pretty revolutionary. It is groundbreaking to finally allow women, decide over their bodies, etc., etc. So there are moments in this ugly, crappy public, hegemonic public sphere that are incredibly beautiful, and we would like to cherish and maybe have more of them. And yet, the entire mechanism is terrible. So I believe that, and also it is not easy to blame someone specific for that. So there is the responsibility for the quality or lack of quality of the public sphere is problematic. So the image the image and the practice of the public sphere is idealized in liberal and sometimes also conservative political theory. On the left, we have efforts to show that public sphere is not only a form of agency that is created by the elites. So we have Kluge and Knecht, Alexander Kluge, Oskar Knecht, two German very interesting thinkers and also filmmaker. Kluge tried to film the capital, incredibly boring cinematic experiment, however, interesting also to see as an effort, right? So we have Kluge and Knecht who discover that the workers of factories, specifically the proletarians, have been creating public debates about matters that are important for them. They would discuss things slightly different from what the bourgeoisie would discuss. So they would discuss their salaries and other economic questions, for instance, which are excluded from the traditional public sphere. And like that, they would contest the basic values on which the public sphere sits on. Let's use the colloquialism. And then there are further excursions towards diversifying the public sphere, and there is Nancy Fraser with her concept of feminist counterpublics, where she speaks of the US-American feminist movement as a counterpublic sphere. What does it mean? It means that, first of all, she challenges the notion of one public sphere. She thinks that every excluded group, every group of citizens, every group of people more generally, maybe even non-humans, if we speak about it with her right now, can create a public debate and a form of public sphere where they express their interests. And so public sphere cannot be one. For the sake of democracy, it cannot be just one. So this is the one moment when she disagrees with liberal thinkers, with Jürgen Habermas and others. And why do I bring all that? Because I think that microfascisms are interventions in the public sphere that change the political discourse in Poland, but also if you look at Trump and how his narrative, his hate speech basically transforms the public debate, how certain things are allowed to be said after Trump, and they were not allowed to be said before Trump, right? So those would be, I think, expressions of microfascism that he himself contributed to the American and the global public debates. And then we can see we can see also a potential for counter movements, counter mobilizations to even hijack the public sphere, to allow a hegemonic narrative of public interest to suddenly become, I don't know, more egalitarian, maybe even revolutionary, feminist, queer, whatever. And those moments of hijacking I find interesting. And this is the anarchy. So I'm kind of, I don't know, it's like a Leninist anarchism maybe, because since a while I've been looking at the potentialities created by precisely contradicting fascism, not only on the level of one, micropolitics versus the other, which was the typical Deleuzian-Guattarian 1960s and 70s sort of strategy, but thinking about how the state, how the public sphere, how those big mechanisms can be used, even corporate mechanisms, or I don't know, multi-state institutions, how they can be used to generate things that can be called something between micropolitics and maybe counterpublics, and how on that level, on that scale, not only responses to fascism, but also alternatives to fascism can be created. So I'm not sure if it exactly answers the question, but I was trying to, draw an image of anti-fascist policy that might maybe be of interest for all of us to, look into.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think I'm with you on that. I think I share some reticence about talking about public spheres for two reasons. One of which is I did my master's degree at the New School, and Habermas was basically like the state religion there, which sort of gives you a certain allergy to it. And particularly, it's sort of a uneasiness with the sort of stateness of it. And that's why I'm particularly interested when Reno talks about those are the idea of the non-state public sphere, but he never really expands it more than for like 2 sentences. So just like this could be a thing, and then never goes back to it, which is a little bit disappointing. But I'm thinking about here about how an anti-fascist politics would be developing its own needs, its capacities, but not just being thrown back into, like you were saying, a kind of contest of different kinds of micropolitics. Like if the problem is that microfascism scales in a certain way, what is the scalar relationship of a kind of self-reproducing anti-fascism that cares for itself? If it's not, if the horizon isn't working towards shifting the public sphere because that's a state framing, then what is the horizon being worked to shifting, right? I mean, at this moment, if I was Jody Dean, I would start talking about, now we form the new party, which is now more flexible. I like Jody Dean a lot, right? But I'm not Jody Dean, so I'm not going to go there. But at least then you have a framing of what you're trying to do, right?
But there are different ways of, sorry for jumping in here, but I just wanted to put on the table a notion from Guattari, the notion of transversality, which is incredibly helpful in precisely expressing the desire to create something that goes beyond the scale, the micro scale of micropolitics that either produces alternative to fascism or contradicts it or both. So transversality, as far as I understand Guattari here, is a notion of a social change that works across the boundaries and the contradictions, such as reform or revolution, institution or grassroots, that kind of thing. So I'm imagining always the anti-fascism that I would be happy with as operating on all these levels. So I can very well imagine a prime minister and a squatter and a, I don't know, independent media person and intellectuals and artists and factory workers, whoever you want to put together, working in their different sectors or even transversally across those boundaries to build a very different world. And I would put the discussion whether state is interesting as a form or not for later. So first I would want an anti-fascism, and then we decide whether we live in a state or in a whatever else. So this shift of priority is already my addition. I don't think Guattari was opting for that, but I think it logically follows from his concept of transversality understood as social mechanism, social movement, social change working across those normally scandalizing differences in formats, in politics, in strategy. But I let you.
It's interesting you mentioned transversality, and maybe this gets us to it a bit to the centrality of feminist politics and underappreciated females. Do you know who originally coined the idea of transversality? It's not Guattari. It's a doctor named Jeanette Michaud who works at the board, and transversality is used as a way to describe the rotation of organizing practices and tasks within the board, and sort of in a certain way, it's kind of a very fancy way of saying the chore wheel, of how not just you rotate who's doing what, but also how you rotate the subjectivity of the labor being produced there.
Right. I think that's really key, actually, because I mean, sometimes transversality it makes us see, it's like we're making connections to existing positions. We're just doing it to positions we typically don't consider part of us. But yet you're right. It's like it's actually undermining also the positionality of those positions. So for instance, the authority of doctors was actually crucial to that transversality in Le Bourd, right? And so to displace the comfort of well, for some, the comfort of the sovereign subject that holds a position. And so that, I mean, at different scales, I think is so I think for me, I mean, the thing I think I agree with along these lines is, for me, this is a project of composing, right? It's a compositional project with a goal. If there's any goal, it's to create a certain kind of social body, broadly speaking. What kind of social body is that? It would be one that, and this maybe gets us into some of your key concepts. You have like weak resistance, right? Is one that can achieve its, again, how we make those decisions, very important. The governance, the decision-making processes, but achieves it has the capacities to achieve its goals and reach its limits to what its goal is, which is to, in this case, let's say, prevent fascism. So, so how we do that, we can look to examples, but I do think something like transversality matters, whether or not. I think for me, I would go into a mode of a defense mode, like community defense is the place, the coping with the harshness of current conditions, the care and the therapeutic dimension of keeping ourselves together, even the people we recognize as comrades or as friends or as intimates, or as strangers, right? As well, to have that. I mean, I think sometimes it's fragile enough that before we can so-called build power, as people say, or is to nurture and care for the fledgling experiments, the kind of what do you say, like weather-beaten dimensions of our movements, which have, suffered some harms and continue to do so. So I think there's a way to begin in some of those positions too, as a way of moving towards a kind of political body.
I like the idea of political body because it's very material, but also it's living. So it's not matter, it's sort of dead, but it's actually embodied. So that's interesting. However, I was thinking of, of a certain, of some notions that recently came to my attention, like for instance, dignity or universality or equality for that matter. I realized, and this is also, for anarchist discussion, a very controversial statement that I'm gonna, say right now. But I was thinking many times in the recent years of semi-fascist government in Poland and in some other countries about the constitution and other legal documents that preserved the sense of equality, dignity, and universal rights that no other text delivers. So thinking of culture, and this is something that I was missing in your book. Obviously, we cannot write about everything, so I do understand this omission. But for me, it is an important omission. So I would, if I was writing your book, I would have legal documents and the form of law as an element of culture. I would definitely have it. But this also comes from how I think politically, and so if I may experiment on like restructuring your book a little bit or adding something to it, I would go with that. I would look at the legal documents as those residues where not only such words as universal, equal, dignified life and things like that appear, but also they resonate, they mean something. When an entire, million of people on the streets of Warsaw demands equality in legal treatment, or 500,000 of people, was it? They actually, there is more than just words. It was creating a common. It was an expression of a political demand, which was really, it felt very relevant. It wasn't just relevant, but it also felt like that. And this is something that I'm missing, because I don't think anybody opens Communist Manifesto to find this, also this sensation of, of dignity or equality or revolution or whatever else. But opening Constitution, we can get there. Or opening other legal documents that allow, different people, for instance, to stay in Poland, not just enter Poland, but also stay here. So what I'm trying to get at is that in order to create this kind of alternative to fascism, or, non-fascist living or non-fascist body, social body, we also need a discourse that allows to express political interests and desires. And this discourse cannot, unfortunately, solely consist in expressions of desires understood more sexually, or, I don't know, access to labor or freedom of labor for that matter. But it also has to speak to our understanding of, I don't know, life on earth, sense, community, all those big values. And this is where I think fascism is winning spectacularly, because they have answers to this kind of needs. They have words that actually have meaning and that make people, have goosebumps on their back, because these words are exciting. Tradition for many of those people actually means things. And then on the left, we don't have this kind of mobilizing, performatively ultra active notions. And paradoxically, we don't even have texts that have them. And the texts that are used to create that sensation are actually legal documents. How about that? And what do we?
Steve, do you want to answer this? Yeah, go ahead.
If I can jump on in your editing to edit your edit, I would say one person who does that kind of work is someone like Peter Linebaugh. like in his book Magna Carta Manifesto, looks at how the commons come out of just like not sort of just like amazing goodwill or people being generous, but the Magna Carta and particularly the Treaty of the Forest. So he's looking at particular legal documents which create a history, which create certain rights and narratives. Now the problem is that that's not maybe not exciting, and then you have a question about how you frame that. But I think that can be done, and thinking about different notions of collectivity and desire, and looking at how that they are underpinned by legal documents. But yeah, what would you say, Jack?
That was a good one, because I'm glad you brought that one up, because it's, you know, it's a pre-modern one in a sense. I mean, it was, or the passage to something. I think we have in the US, we have plenty of people who think that fascism is primarily a response to liberal democracy with values of universalism and equality, and that we need to preserve those concepts. I mean, that to me is the dominant strain of fascism studies and anti-fascist discourse in the US, has been precisely that we need to kind of preserve and reinvigorate our modern liberal attachments to those things. I am less taken by those, even though they are enshrined in different laws and constitutions. I do think something that the right has, that the left has dropped, is a notion of kind of pre-modern, and the archaic and the ancestral and one might call it the spiritual, for the sake of things that seem secular, the things that seem it's become actually, yeah, bloodless. It's become bodiless, these values. So to me, it is important to go back to the forest, you know, in the ways, to the commons, to the places where people developed forms of life that then got enshrined into these concepts and into these documents. But if we start with the documents that we have, I think we've already lost the war with fascism, because they don't need documents. They have imagination. They have a generative production of culture they can turn to, called tradition, whether they've invented or not, right? I mean, it's so I think the kind of the lack of invention in the kind of imaginative sense, but also grounded in certain kinds of other traditions. This is why, you know, my impulse is always to go with the witch, right? It's like, no matter what, we go with the witches, because
That's
it's
a good strategy.
yeah, you know, just at least the sort of, in all the ways we want to talk about it, contemporary forms, Silvia Federici's form of the kind of the introduction of the necessary sacrifice for capitalism, for racial capitalism, for primitive accumulation, whether it's a figure of, you know, the founding, or a figure of possibility, to me is like, so I think I'm drawn to more things like that, as ways that also excite people, because they do bring people together. The question is then again, I think, what it means to take that out of a kind of small scale subculture or niche interest into something that is a form of life. That's a little harder to figure out.
Maybe I'll ask one more question for you both, and maybe we'll use this as a way to sort of work towards a sort of an ending of sorts. But one of the things we started with was there was a bit about how in some ways a big part of contemporary fascist dynamics is almost a response to, for instance, the presence of for instance, around gender, is a response to the presence of females emphasis of power, right? And oftentimes you look at it in different ways. For instance, whenever you have a very visible trans figure, there's then a backlash. Whenever you have a very visible, for instance, a Black US president, you get a certain backlash. Then my question is then, if we're thinking about a politics of self-care, of building spaces for movements, when you know that any visibility to people being in public will have that kind of response, how do you how can we think through organizing around that without almost like going into like a braced reactive position almost in advance? You know what I mean? Because you don't want to like let the worry about the response condition the thing you're doing in the first place, because then it almost becomes like kind of like cramped or too cramped, where it lacks that that transversality, that the care, that ability to be flexible. You almost take out the joy in a way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of it has to be a kind of response because we're anti-fascist, right? So the anti part is actually pretty crucial. So we have to do that. But I think what you're asking also is like what are the forms of either, prevention, contestation that are also not going to play the same game of visibility and then reaction and then defeat and then come back. So I mean, I think this is an important time of experimentation. I do think, I mean, I was just thinking a couple of things today about this. Or one recently, somebody was talking about the way DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, gets attacked now by the right in the U.S. and how it's almost like the more modest our claims are or our attempts, the harsher also the reaction. So I think now of like campuses in the US, right? Encampments were well within the boundaries of freedom of speech and expression on these campuses. These were not, violent actions, but the way that the response happened was so significant and so repressive that there's something about that I think is compelling us to think like, wow, power is so fragile, or the systems of established power are so fragile that even the more modest ones, modest actions will receive this. Okay, what does that tell us? Does it tell us to keep being more modest, right? Or is there some kind of new innovation that might happen around a kind of non-heroic, I will say, non-heroic courage, right?
Absolutely.
Also,
absolutely. No, it sounds fantastic. And like on the same note, I would add an example that I depict in my book in Feminist Antifascism is an example of an artwork. It's called Ophelia, Iconographies of Madness. This is the title of the art project that I'm discussing. And I wrote a text about it called Ophelic Counterpublics. So I was very inspired by Zorka Wolny, a Polish Berlin-based artist who invited 12 actresses aged between 20-something and 80-something. And each of them played Ophelia at a certain point, probably when they were young, of their careers. But they are, the age difference was 60-something years between them. And each of them played the Ophelia in different theater, in different methods. Poland has a lot of theaters, so it was so what the artwork I depicted was about was basically a kind of, I don't know what this format is really, because it wasn't a theater piece, it wasn't a performance. You think about what it was, I don't know, but it consisted in Ophelia coming one after another and doing the Ophelia and then going out of stage and then another one and another. And it was 2.5 hours of Ophelias of different versions, more hysteric, less hysteric, more, autistic, sometimes two of them at once, speaking, not speaking, entering a conversation with the audience or not. All kinds of, and what I realized when I was looking at actually I only saw the video, shortened version of this piece, but I realized that these are all voices that we will never hear in public debate, because none of them could be allowed in, maybe 1 or 2 out of 12, and then so thinking of this experimenting that you're talking about, but I'm thinking also scale. So I'm thinking of schools being not only accommodating people with, I don't know, speech impediments or people not able to speak the language. Now in Poland, we have masses of Ukrainian students who often don't speak Polish. So there is a big systemic and very observable, very visible issue of how to conduct, education in such circumstances where not everybody understands the language and yet everybody has to pass the tests, right? So I'm thinking of the state actually as an interesting mechanism in the context, because when we think in anarchist context, when we think state, we think police. And of course, there are reasons for that. But if we think state in terms of medical care or schooling, also not favorite forms of interaction that I can think of. But on the other hand, perhaps crucial and formative in some way. So this kind of situations of that now we see as deficiency, like for instance, the inability to speak a language or inability to speak in a certain way, they can become reasons to actually not include in this numeric sense, right? But to transform and transversally transform, if you want, the whole strategy of how education is built. Because if we have so many kids who don't understand Polish, clearly we have to do something else in our lessons than we did with Polish-speaking kids, right? So, at least to some extent. So what I'm thinking of in terms of transformation, but also big scale transformation, and avoiding small scale. I think we've experimented enough. I think artistic and other activist forms of experiment, they had their momentum, and now they should all jump on bigger boards, basically. That would be my demand. If I may produce demands here, that would be one of them. We need to try to see what happens if a gazilliard of artists shape a cultural program for a country or for a state or for a village or something bigger than 5 people and their audience. Because I think we have been training enough. And I love the artistic experimentation, really. I've been part of it a lot. I've written about it. It's fantastic. But now, how these experiences that we have acquired plenty of since the 60s, since the Les Guattari, since Laborde that you mentioned, and other smaller scale experiments, how can all this, so this would be my effort to be on one hand very reformist, because this is a very polite demand. It's like we have had so much experiments sponsored by states very often. So why don't we try to use them in the large format? So this is, I think, the worst nightmare of a fascist. Is people like us, thinking of, okay, so let's implement all those little experimentations that we've been doing on the margins of society in this big machine. How is this going to be? So that would be my example of precisely having a bigger dream, and I would say a more radical dream, because I think what I'm saying is incredibly radical. I'm not sure, yes, but my intuition tells me that it might be incredibly radical. So just put all those experimenting people on the board of big institutionalized structure, and the money that go with it, because it's a lot of money, and we all make this money happen. So we are, I think, very well entitled to also use, or at least decide how it's being used. And I think this kind of dreams, I agree wholeheartedly with this idea that the more modest protest form is, the more brutal. I mean, the protest in Germany now, the situation with protesting against Israeli genocide in Palestine, this is incredible censorship, incredibly powerful, strong, atrocious, I would say, censorship. Now my friends are going to court cases of students who are persecuted one by one. So they don't make cases for like 20 students or something. No, every one student. And of course, all those who want to support those people, they have to spend months in trials, in courts, instead of doing something else. So it's a persecution full on. Almost nobody gets sentenced because nobody violated any laws, obviously. It's a big mechanism of. So I'm wondering to what extent a sort of non-violent, weak resistance could be made a little bit more flamboyant, let's say, to to make the German states actually step back a little bit. So this is a lively example, but I genuinely like the idea of having a wilder and larger scale imagination as a part of this whole anti-fascist project. And imagining situations, I mean, the part of my activism in the not so long, not so far away past was precisely to make, I don't know, street party in the middle of the largest street in Warsaw. A very non-violent, sound system, grass, flowers, what you want, full-on hippie situation. But in the, for a passerby, it was amazing because it was a bunch of flower power kids and children, actually. Very important, because the police doesn't harass a crowd when there are children. So we actually did something that perhaps ethically is controversial, but nothing happened to anyone. So I hope we will be forgiven. But then for a person who passes, it was an unforgettable image, because it was something that could never possibly happen, and yet it was happening. So I agree that's a good plan to have more imagination, but I would institute this imagination. I would actually fuel institutional. I would think of the commons and institutions as entities that can be overlapping. So I would think of commoning the institutions. I would think that direction. And in Europe, I'm not sure about the American context, but in Europe, in some countries at least, we have this whole heritage of like, you know, national owning of institutions and of the state as such. I mean, this was the propaganda of communist state. So although they did not allow the people to control things, if you probably know that, but this idea was inserted in our minds, and we can do something about it and with it, I think. Sorry for speaking such a terribly long.
No. I think that's a good sort of thought and image to end with. Almost the question of how do we scale up spaces for imagination and not just allow sort of our practices to be in a sort of micro political bubble. And I think we can use that as a way to as sort of, you know, end with a question of how, because I think it's tricky, but it's a good one. So with that, I'll say thank you to both of you very much. Thanks for coming along. And everyone should make sure to look at the links to Jack and Eva's book that I'm going to put in the description. And thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. And I'm so sorry that it was so short because it felt like nothing really. I want to discuss more with you. So if there is at any point a need for more conversation, I would be super happy and hopefully more healthy, because right now I'm speaking with a lot of effort. So, but if there is a possibility of doing more discussions, I'm all in. So, and thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm glad you were able to push through, you know, the illness. It sounded, it's really great. So thank you.
Song of praise, a song